So section 8 deals with fungal ecology, and your learning outcomes are 3 in this one. So number 1, here you got to identify a trait that contributes to the value of fungi in a symbiotic relationship, and then describe the living components of lichens, which are made up of 2 different organisms living together, and then list examples of fungal associations with different organisms. For example, fungi with trees. Fungi and bacteria, by the way, are in ecosystems are the main decomposers in the biosphere. So they help break down dead bodies of trees and animals and so on to cycle back those nutrients into the ecosystem. Many of the fungi, just like with bacteria, they're difficult to culture in the laboratory, but analysis of DNA found in soil samples, among other locations, have revealed that there is DNA present for fungi that have not been formally described because they can't grow them in culture. So the DNA evidence suggests there's a lot more fungal or fungi species than we've been able to grow in the lab, and the same is true for bacteria. So again, the role of fungi along with bacteria are to make materials available to other organisms. And to do this, fungi have enzymes that allow them to break down things like cellulose, which you find in wood. Lignin is a component of wood that makes the cellulose even more rigid and hard to decompose. And when they do this, they're basically releasing compounds that contain carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus back to the soil that can be cycled back and picked back up by producers like plants. So fungi do have a range of symbioses. A symbiosis is an intimate, close relationship between 2 living organisms. So the some categories of fungal symbiosis include obligate symbiosis, and obligate means they're obligated. In this case, the fungus cannot live without its associate, or its the one that it lives in symbiosis with. An example are fungi that live in the roots of plants, and they belong to a specific phylum called Glomeromycota. And so they need that association in order to complete their life cycle. And then facultative is symbiosis. It's not essential. For facultative, the fungus can live with or without another organism. And so that's facultative. Obligate, you got to. Now, some of the interactions with fungi and other organisms include pathogenic. And here, the pathogen harms the host by causing a disease. Okay. There's also parasitic relationships, and the parasite harms the host by maybe stealing nutrients from it, but does not cause disease. So it seems that they're not exactly the same thing. Parasites can cause disease in the host, in which case it would be parasitic and pathogenic, but not all parasites are pathogens. Okay. Then there's commensal relationships. These are general terms that we might see in symbiotic relationships, but we're applying them to fungi. And in some cases, they're commensal relationships, and they benefit. One partner benefits, and the other one is not harmed or benefit at all. So only one benefits, the other one nothing happens to it. And then mutualistic relationships, where both partners benefit from it, like in the case of lichens that we saw in the laboratory already. And I should point out that many fungi are just free living. They're just out there decomposing materials. So they're not involved in any symbioses. If your relationship includes living inside a plant, then we might call those endophytes. So the fungi would be endophytic. And in some cases, this benefits the plant species, as the fungus may provide some sort of protection for the plant. So they're going to live, the fungi, their hyphae, are going to live in the intracellular spaces of plants. So they're going to live between cells. Now, some endophytes, though, may not benefit the host, and those would be parasitic. In other cases, there's commensalistic relationships here. Now, when it comes to benefiting the host, a fungus may provide some protection by producing toxins that harm herbivores. So if you have an endophyte and the fungus is living with a plant, the fungus provides a toxin that doesn't harm the plant but might harm an animal that's trying to eat the plant. So there's an example there with Italian ryegrass. It's more resistant to aphids, which are insects that suck fluid out of the plant, and that's stealing from the plant. There's a fungus there, endophyte, that seems to reduce the number of aphids, and that would suggest that perhaps the fungus is providing some kind of a toxin that negatively impacts the aphid insects. So there's an experiment here where described where they put aphids, 5 aphids in each 2 different groups of plants, one experimental, one a control group. And so they took the same kind of plant, the ryegrass, and they had one growing with fungal endophyte, so a fungus growing along with it, and then in the other case, just the ryegrass without the fungus. Here, so that would be your control. Of course, they had replicates, right, and as any good experiment would have. But you start with 5 aphids, and then after a while, you see how much the population has changed. In other words, how many aphids are being born and survive in that situation. And you can see the results down here with the bar graphs. Here in the little whiskers above and below the bar are error. They're error bars. There's a range of values. But you can see that with no endophyte or no fungus, a lot more aphids were able to grow alongside that plant, possibly harming the plant because the aphids are stealing from the plant and eating off of the plant. So you can see the average number was a lot more after 36 days, 100 aphids on average for no endophyte. And then here, much less, maybe about 35 aphids after those 36 days. So it seems that the fungus in this experiment, the evidence would suggest the fungus reduced the growth of the herbivore. So that would be an example of providing some sort of protection against herbivores. Then we have the lichens here, and the lichens are examples of endosymbiosis or endosymbiotic relationship here, and this is between a fungus, a fungal partner, and a photosynthetic partner. And the photosynthetic partner lives inside. It's usually a cyanobacteria or green algae, or sometimes both. And the cyanobacteria, green algae require a moist environment to survive, so the fungus provides that space for them. And you can see the cross section through the body of a fungus, or the thallus of a fungus. And you can see the hyphae are stained dark purple in color. The hyphae are part of the fungus there. And then these greenish looking circles, those are the algae cells or the algal cells that are doing photosynthesis. So as is beneficial, the algae have a place to live, whereas the fungus is going to get nutrients from the algae, right? So the relationship is mutually beneficial, so it's mutualistic. It seems that so mutualistic that the type of fungus is in the phylum Ascomycota. So Ascomycetes is just what they call them, commonly call them. So the Ascomycota, those are the sac fungi, and so that's true for about most of the lichen species. There's been about 20 that have been some other type of fungus from some other phylum. And then when we look at lichens in their biology, the fungi for the lichens are usually not able to grow normally or efficiently without their photosynthetic partners. So it's possible if you got the fungus by itself without the algae, they don't grow as well. The fungi do protect the partners from strong light and from drying out. Desiccation needs to dry out. And lichens can invade very harsh environments, even growing on rocks where there's no soil. And some of the fungi do have striking colors. You can see the images below here, and they have different growth forms. There's those that kind of grow in sort of a three-dimensional masses are fruticose. And then you have those that grow just right at the surface and look like they're encrusted on the surface, say, of a rock or bark, and they're bark of a tree. Those are called crutose. And then those that look like paint peeled off the surface, they're kind of flat growing along the surface, but then look like paint pieces of paint are peeling off. Those are foliose growth patterns. This is just categories of growth patterns for lichens. Lichens, because they get everything they need, they can grow on a rock. They don't get much from soil because there's no soil there, but they can get most of what they need from the air, including nitrogen for building amino acids and DNA or nucleic acids, and water from the air. So if they're getting things they need from the air, then they're going to be sensitive to air pollutants. So they don't do well in places where there's a lot of air pollution. And then we have the mycorrhizae, and these are symbiotic relationships between fungus. Myco means fungus, and rhizae refers to rhizo means root. So this is association between a plant root and a fungus. And these are mutualistic relationships, again, so both benefit. And these relationships were key as we talked about how ancestors of plants started in aquatic environments. These were relatively simpler, multicellular organisms that are called algae, and then the green algae eventually moved on to land. And that movement onto land was associated with developing relationships with fungi that early on. So about 90% of all plants are found, the vascular plants anyway, are found to have these mycorrhizal associations, or in other words, these symbiotic relationships. And what the fungi do, because they grow, their growth form, the body of it is these very thin filamentous hyphae that we've seen in the earlier section. Those hyphae grow out of the root of the plant, and that helps increase surface area for better absorption and better contact, so you can get water and minerals into the plant. Now, how does the fungus benefit? The fungus is going to get nutrients like sugars for their metabolism. So it's a mutualistic relationship. There's two principal kinds. There's the arbuscular mycorrhizae and then the ectomycorrhizae. And ecto means on the outside. So these are going to grow and it would be associated with the outside of the root and the outside of the root cells. The arbuscular ones are a little bit more intimately tied in there. So let's take a look here. Here's the arbuscular ones. And these are the ones that they belong to the phylum that was mentioned earlier, the Glomeromycota. So they're glomeromycetes. And this is the most common type of mycorrhizae. Here, there's no above ground fruiting structures, and they do assist the plant gaining more nutrients. So there's a little mention here how this could potentially improve crop yields because it allows crop, which are plants that we eat, to have better contact with the soil and absorb the minerals they need and water. And phosphate is a real big one that plants need to grow. Now here the hyphae penetrate the root cell walls, but they don't go into the membranes here. So you can see in the diagram here, and then there's an electron micrograph to the right. You can see the hyphae in the image here, and they penetrate into the root. And so you can see the hyphae going in. And recall that the structure that gets into the cell, not into the living cell itself, but at least into the cell wall, those are called haustoria or haustorium singular. So you can see the haustoria there in this area here. And if we zoom in to it for comparison with the other group of mycorrhizae, you can see here that the haustoria are penetrating into the cell wall. And it looks like they're inside the cell, but they're not in the cell. So they're between the cell, plasma membrane, plant cell, and the cell wall there. So that's the arbuscular mycorrhizae. Remember that they are the fungi. These type of fungi belong to a phylum called Glomeromycota. And then we have the ectomycorrhizae, and these tend to be basidiomycetes. So most of them. So the basidiomycetes, remember that's the phylum Basidiomycota that mushrooms belong to. So these are the hosts here are forest trees, including pines and oaks. There's about 5,000 species of fungi that are involved as ectomycorrhizal relationships, with these ectomycorrhizae. And here the hyphae are going to surround the root and root cells, but they don't penetrate into the cell walls like the prior one. Neither one's going to penetrate into the cell there. So you can see here in the image on the right, you have an electron micrograph looking at the hyphae surrounding the root, which would be hyphae like this here. But then the hyphae penetrate into, but stay within the cell walls. They don't get into the cell wall where the cells are located. So let's look a little more closely for comparison here. So you can see that in this case here, we don't have the hyphae getting into the cell wall where the cell is located. Now remember, neither one, so this one and the other one don't get into the cell itself, but for the case of the ectomycorrhizae, they don't even get into the cell wall where the cell's located. And then we have some symbioses with animals here, ruminant animals, which these include cows and goats and sheep. Ruminants have multiple chambers in their stomach, and one of the chambers is called a rumen, so they call them ruminant animals. And in the rumen, when the cow eats the grass, the grass gets mixed with this been chewed up, and it gets mixed in with this fluid, or this digestive fluid that contains microbes, including bacteria and fungi that belong to the Neocalamastica mycota, which was covered in an earlier section there. They're also found may be found in the gut of termites as well. So it's a combination of these fungi and bacteria and even some protists that can help digest cellulose. And then you have leafcutter ants, and these leafcutter ants actually farm a fungus, and they actually eat the fungus. So they go out and they will collect leaves off of trees and stuff, and then they bring the leaves in there, and the fungi use the leaves for energy because fungi are heterotrophic, right? And so these are literally farming, and this is underground. So section 9 is going to cover the funguses that are parasites and cause disease. They're pathogenic. And so your learning outcomes for this one is to review the pathogenic effects of fungi on other organisms, and then explain why treating fungal diseases in animals is actually kind of difficult. So many fungal species can cause diseases in plants, and these type of fungi that are pathogenic to plants can be pests for us because many plants we rely on either for crops or for natural areas where forests are located. Fungi can actually spoil food that we've harvested from crops, so that can also be a problem in our food storage. And here you can see that the fungus that is in the two pictures here, so this is actually image B and C, and the one on the next page, I think, is image A, is thought to be one of the world's largest organisms because the mycelium is growing under the soil and covers a really, really large area, many acres, or hectares is the metric unit for area there. And you can see the damage done to this particular, probably was a tree there. And then here you can see the fruiting bodies coming out of a, looks like a tree trunk there. And those kind of look like basidiocarps. I'm not sure what phylum this Amarillaria, which is the genus for this organism. But here you can see the effects from above here. The caption describes that the damage done to these pine trees in Montana. With this one circle here, you can see the damage of the trees in there. That encompasses 8 hectares, which is a pretty broad area there. A hectare is 1,000 meters, not 1,000 meters, is 100 meters by 100 meters. That would be a hectare. So that would be 10,000 square meters. So 8 of those or 80,000 square meters just right there, and you can see another patch here and so on of the fungus. And then the mycelium is all under all of that soil there. So that's pretty large, and this is pathogenic and damages entire ecosystems by killing trees. Fungi can become harmful because they're growing in an area and they produce secretions that can be toxic. If it's in food, it can be unpalatable, which destroys the taste. In some cases, they're carcinogenic, the secretions. That means they're going to cause cancer, or they're poisonous and cause damage to major organs, can be even fatal. There's a fungus called Fusarium, it's the genus, that produces a vomit toxin. I mean, look at that. That sounds like vomit, right? Like maybe it's going to make you gag. But this toxin can cause brain damage if you consume it accidentally. And then there's Aspergillus flavus, which produces a aflatoxin, which is very toxic. It can damage kidneys and your nervous system, and even causing death. So here you can see what looks like the conidia, and this is a conidiophore right here. The conidia are asexual spores that are produced by fungi. And then over here you see a smut growing on corn. And this one, in this case, is not necessarily toxic. This is actually, I think, edible. As the description says, is actually a delicacy in Hispanic cuisine. I think I've seen people who consume it not too far from here. So I've never eaten it, but it's definitely not Aspergillus, but it's a kind of fungus called a smut. And remember, the conidiophores are what we would see in the phylum Ascomycota as asexual spores. And the reason they're called conidia is because these asexual spores are produced on the ends of hyphae. They're not produced within a sporangium. So that's a distinction there. Now, there's going to be fungi that do affect humans and other animals in a harmful way. One of them that causes, these are some of the ones that cause disease. One is in the genus Candida. And it's we would call they call these yeast infections. It's a kind of yeast. It's not the kind we use to make beer or wine, but they cause thrush, which is a yeast infection in the mouth, or in the genital region, vaginal yeast infections. Males can also get yeast infections as well. There's another species of fungus called Pneumocystis girovesii, which causes pneumonia in AIDS patients. AIDS patients the disease is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome caused by infection of HIV. And then there's the fungus that causes athlete's foot, which affects the feet. Ringworm, which is not a worm, it's a fungus. And then nail fungal infections. All of those do damage or affect in a negative way in humans. Now, trying to treat these fungal diseases because of a fungal infection are kind of hard to do, because you might remember that fungi and animals share a common ancestor, so they're phylogenetically related. So that means that their biochemistry, their molecular biology, there's close relation to them. So if you're going to design drugs, you want to make sure that the drugs that are going to slow or prevent the growth of the fungi don't mess up the metabolism of the animal cells that are infected by it. And then we have this one here. This is a species of chytrid. So remember that the chytrids, or the Chytridiomycota, these are aquatic fungi, and they have is one of the groups that has flagella. Still has flagella on it. Many fungi don't have flagella anymore. They lost it through maybe a process like evolutionary reversal. But the Chytridiomycota, there is one species that is affecting amphibians all over the world, and it's thought to have been introduced into other ecosystems by amphibians or frog in the genus Xenopus. And this one you find in the aquarium trade as a frog you put in your aquarium. It's also used in research. So when people get these and then they don't, for use as pet or in research, and if they get released into the environment, they're carrying this fungus, and then it gets introduced because the spores go into the environment and they get picked up by amphibians that are not used to this fungus. They've never seen it before in their evolution, and so it does a lot of damage. Xenopus can handle this fungal infection, but they can't. The name of the species of the fungus that is causing these massive die-offs of fungi all over, it's causing major declines, and it's a big conservation concern. Let me see if I can pronounce this here. It's Batrachochytrium dendrobatitis, and that causes the disease chytridiomycosis. And what happens here is that the chytrid invades the skin of the amphibian, and the amphibians rely on their skin to help exchange gas in the atmosphere. They do have lungs. Their lungs are not as efficient as, say, our lungs or higher vertebrates, and so they do supplement their supply of oxygen with their skin, and so the chytrids come in there and mess up the function of the skin, and then that causes the death of the individual. And when too many individuals die in a population, it crashes and becomes locally extinct. So that's a sad note to what happens when species get released in ecosystems they don't belong in.